Alright, so last week when we were talking about Hellboy, I kind of alluded to the idea of wanting to talk about the Blade trilogy before too long. And then, like, shortly after I said that, I got a bit overzealous and decided that that should be really, really soon, and that I kind of wanted to do that as soon as possible. Revisit the trilogy and then just talk about it more or less. So that's what we're going to do now. And we're going to just kind of start with the first one and just work our way through them and see all the really high points and the really low points at the same time. But let's actually just start with the first one, as we should. And the thing about the first Blade is it obviously has a lot. When you look at where we are now with comic book movies, and you see all these different ones, like breaking new ground and all that stuff. And you go back, and usually the one the movie that's credited with sort of starting the craze all over again was the first X-Men movie in 2000, which was shortly followed up 2 years later by Raimi's Spider-Man, and so on. But there are those people now that like to go back a little further and say that when you talk about the ground that was broken with comic book movies, Blade is often overlooked. Because you've got the fact that it was 2 years prior to X-Men, it was rated R. It's a black superhero. A year before The Matrix came out, it used bullet time in the same way he shoots at Frost. And one of the lead characters is a woman that is not used as a love interest. So it's got all this stuff. The whole black superhero thing is nice. But it is also one of those cases where I feel like a lot of the times I hear it, unfortunately, it feels a bit disingenuous because it feels like less a celebration of Blade and more just people looking for petty reasons to take another jab at Black Panther. But even so, the point stands regardless. So yeah, so Blade was kind of ahead of the curve on a lot of things back in 1998 that we're talking about again now. So when you look at it, the whole trilogy, it does come from three different directors, so there might be like a bit of an inconsistency, especially when you look at who the directors are. This one is brought to us by Stephen Norrington, and one of the first things that probably comes to mind with him would be The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And then obviously the sequel is Guillermo del Toro, amazing. And then David S. Goyer, who wrote all three movies, took on the directing job for Trinity. So, yeah, but let's talk about the different directions these are coming from, because when you look at the first Blade, you would never suspect that the director that made this awesome movie made something like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Something so bland, boring, and forgettable. Made a movie that just goes off the charts insane with the different sort of ideas that it has, and the way the whole movie looks, whether it be the production design or the way it's shot and all that, the way that it really does just feel like a comic movie come to life in all of its bloody glory, all that great stuff. So and the way that it sets up sort of the two different worlds, where it's I think Blade's exact words were the world as we know it is just a sugar-coated topping, and the vampires and the bloodfests and all that are what the real world is, and the way in which he sees it as somebody who can live in both those worlds after his mother was bit by a vampire shortly before giving birth to him, thus leaving him half human and half vampire. So when we open, we immediately start with a scene that is in like horror movie history forever, vampire movie history certainly, with this blood rave, where the dude is brought in seemingly just to this 1990s sort of rave before blood starts coming out of the sprinklers and everybody turns into a vampire and starts to attack him. And that is immediately also our introduction to our hero. And I really like the way this scene is split up color-wise also, because you've got first you just got sort of the strobe effect going on as the rave is happening, and then once the blood comes down, everything turns red. But then when Blade appears, he's in this area of the room that has like a blue to it, and then it's like split up between this red and blue before that collides, and the whole thing, that's just one of the many ways this movie actually looks really good also, apart from just doing everything else just about right about it also. And then obviously he goes right into action, and this sort of immediately shows like just sort of the way that he moves in these fight sequences is really what brings these action scenes to life, and the way that because like one thing that just comes to mind immediately is when I was growing up, I obviously had a shitload of like movie related action figures. And one of my absolute favorite action figures that I had was the Blade one, because usually in those cases it was like, you know, their arm would move, or their leg would move or whatever, but he was made like, whoever manufactured him I hope got a raise, because like every single part of his body had like a hinge on it to where he could move and do all the things that he does in the movies. He even came with the leather jacket that actually had the hole in it that his sword would fit in. And it was fantastic. And so to watch him in all these action scenes, he just sort of moves in the ways that we don't really... It almost seems like the superhero fights we see today seem bland by comparison. And on top of the fact that he uses a sword and they're so blood-drenched and all that. But the way he can just move around and jump around effortlessly and just sort of cut through these crowds of vampires is just... Yeah, the action scenes really... They just don't get better than that in this kind of setup. And there's also another thing that kind of, I feel like something gets a lot more credit than something else is you tend to associate the word motherfucker with Samuel L. Jackson. But I think that's going to do a disservice also to the fact that Wesley Snipes also has his own beautiful delivery of that word many times over. Particularly this opening scene when somebody comes at him and he says like the motherfucker you crazy thing, and just immediately it gives Blade like this distinct personality, because there are a lot of like, you know, dark and quiet things about Blade as the series goes on, and we get to see like some quiet moments where he like struggles with his identity and is still trying to figure out exactly where he fits in this world and all that. But when he's in like pure action mode and motherfucker mode, it's like a whole other thing, and a whole other glorious thing at that. Obviously, when I was like 7 or 8 when the movie came out, and of course all the cool kids wanted to quote the some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill line. All that. I had heard that from a lot of people before I saw the movie, and I had no idea what the fuck they were talking about. So when I saw the movie, it all clicked. And there's also that whole aggression that he has, because we have the opening scene where we see, you know, him being born, and the fact that his mother was killed by, well, supposedly killed by a vampire, who we learn is Deacon Frost, of course, for narrative reasons. So whenever we see him just mowing down these crowds, or any sort of action scene, the great thing that Snipes does here, and that he evokes, is that there's always that sort of aggression, and he even talks about it like in dialogue later, where like every single vampire he kills is like revenge for his mom in some sort of way, and it really just brings this aggression into these scenes also, that where they go just a step just a little bit further than just being an awesome action scene in the way they're done. Like the fact that every kill of every sometimes faceless vampire has some sort of meaning to him. Really brings something to those action scenes also, so I really love that. And I do like also the way they set up the idea of, obviously when you have a certain area with extensive, you know, variations and stories and mythologies behind it and all that, you're gonna have to dismiss some things. So it's, even though it's obviously extremely played out, we do inevitably have to have the scene in this movie where Blade says, yeah, there's this thing and there's this thing, but then there's this dumb thing that the movies do, where he says, like, crosses in holy water don't work. But once again, this is 1998, so that was kind of before it was played out to say the whole, I mean, there is one of these, like, it's the first or the second movie where one of the starts of the narration is Blade saying, forget everything you think you know, which is now one of the most overused lines in any and all movies. And like I said, that sort of dismissing, you know, previous variations or whatever is also sort of a played out thing now. But back then, it was still like it seemed like kind of a new cool thing for him to say, oh yeah, the movies are actually lying. So we'll leave that at that and let the movie have that, without getting too mad over it. But then we also have our villain, played by Stephen Dorff, who is fantastic, obviously. But there's also this whole thing where the great thing about what he does is it's like, whether it be his costumes or his demeanor or just the character in general, where he's sort of like the rogue sort of vampire, because we do have Udo Kier and all the other ones in like the boardroom and like the suits and all that, and it's just like whenever he walks into the room with them, there's just that immediate contrast, where we know he's not quite like them. He's like his whole other thing, which also kind of alludes to the fact that he's a whole other danger than these people also, which I really love. And it just sort of gives him like this sort of classic sort of rogue vibe to him, which is great. It makes him like the perfect adversary for a character like Blade also, who's like that sort of... where Blade is like outcast from like, the world because of what he is, and the fact that he's both, ironically enough, makes him even more of an outcast. The same thing can be said for Frost and his particular circle, if you want to call them that. But going on that also, there are cases where like there's some things that maybe don't hold up as much. Like the one particular scene where they're following the cop around kind of tends to look weird. And yeah, some of the effect shots are going to maybe look a bit dated and all that, especially when they have to go the CGI route. But I don't know. In this particular case, because there's actually a lot of it in Blade 2 also, and Blade 2 is like an incredibly well-made movie. It still has that, shoddy, dated CGI in it from time to time. But I almost feel like there's a sort of charm to it, to the point that it almost feels even more comic booky sometimes. I mean, not all the time. Sometimes you can just say, like, oh, that didn't age well. But there's other times where it's like, you can just run with it, and it's fine. And also the way they set up the whole idea that, pretty early on, that, like, because some vampires are different in the way that they can do whatever, that there could be a vampire like anywhere, like anybody that she sees can be one, and they set up this kind of sort of unsafe, always unsafe environment. Though it's shortly after that we learn what familiars are, and it does kind of take you back to like when he was doing that whole monologue and explaining that to her. You'd think he would have mentioned familiars, but even though that's kind of what he meant, but even so, yeah. So obviously, once it gets down into the story and it opens up for more of the action and more of the sort of how the different vampires go about their different ways, you can sense just this sort of constant creativity lying underneath it and the constant ideas going on. And then with just every new action scene, it's just kind of an awesome cherry on the top. So, yeah, and then you have the interactions between the characters also. I do like there's a particular couple of interactions between him and Karen where it's like a certain favor is done, and then the favor is returned with the whole dislocated arm thing, where it happens to her at the beginning, and he puts it back in place, and then she has to do the same thing to him much later in the movie. It's kind of a nice callback. And then there's the way that it uses, like, the gore, because obviously when we see the vampires killed, they'll just kind of dissolve into ash, and we see their skeletons, and they just crumble. But there are some times where they have fun with the gore. Whether it be when, Frost bites the familiar and just like the river of blood comes out and like mixes with that little pool that's there, and there's the waterfall and all that, and the rubber ducks, which are a nice touch. But then you've got the scene like Udo Kier's death scene, where they kind of mix in, that CGI with the gore also, where we've seen what happens to vampires, but then there's the idea of what happens when sunlight hits them and kills them, and we see just this really gruesome effect where he's like burning but like pulling himself apart at the same time, and it's this really... Yeah, but it's like it's the same thing. That's kind of what we want also. Like it's a vampire movie. We want them to revel in the gore at some point, as long as they're not overdoing it, and the movie certainly doesn't. So, yeah, and then obviously I was talking about stuff like, the way it's shot and the production design in particular, whether it be like the temple at the end, or one particular moment that I like, that's a really nice I was talking about that contrast that Frost has with the other vampires around him. There's the fact that the room he stays in is that room that's like entirely white and like just really, really bright, which is a really interesting contrast because it's usually like, and it always kind of adds to that rogue quality to him where it's like, usually vampires are known for being like they have to avoid the lights and the sun and all that, so they're in like these really dark places at all times. And almost as just like a fuck you to all that. The room that he stays in is the brightest set in the movie. So I really like that also. And then there's the interesting twist, with his mom. I do think I don't think it's like a perfect twist or anything. I don't think it completely and totally sets itself up to the fact that the reveal hits as hard as it probably should have. But still an interesting approach, nevertheless, especially when it gets to the big emotional scene when he has to, really set her free and kill her himself. And then there's also all the fun returning characters like Donald Logue, who keeps coming back over and over again. Tracy Lords is in there, of all people. And yeah, so when you go back and look at it, it's one of those movies that feels like it should be getting dated, but honestly, I feel like it's getting better. Like, the last time I watched it, I remember saying to myself at least a few times, I always really liked this movie, but I didn't remember it being that as good as I think it is now. And it's not even just because of that stuff where, like I said, like, it did bullet time before The Matrix, it was an R-rated superhero movie before it was cool, all that stuff. It's, yeah, everything kind of comes together in this really cool way, just how well made it is, how great, obviously Snipes, like, I want to say the perfect casting choice, but it's like, surely he was the only casting choice, where you just can't imagine somebody who would be able to do the really awesome badass action sequences and move the way that he does so freely, while also kind of having that quiet vulnerability about him in the smaller scenes. And I didn't even mention Chris Christopherson. Their interactions as well are just perfect also. Christopherson's in all those cases where it's just the perfect casting and the perfect banter and all that. Though the way Whistler's death scene is handled is a bit odd to me, especially given what the sequel does. It's like the one case where we're kind of getting into the second one now, but it's like that's kind of one of the only cases of like it seems like kind of clumsy handling between movies, but that's a later factor though. So yeah, so like if you haven't watched this recently and you think that it might end up dated, I honestly feel like it's going in the opposite direction, and I think there's a lot of people out there that probably agree with that also. Like I said, just hopefully not for disingenuous reasons. Hopefully it's, we really appreciate it for what it is because that's what it really deserves. So I was really damn pleased the last time I watched it. It was like, it's really shocking how, like, well it holds up now. So, yeah. So let's go on to probably one of my favorite sequels ever. A movie that I have praised for so long. I even had this poster in my room shortly after it came out for like the longest time, for like 3 or 4 years or something. So about Blade 2, obviously this is brought to us by Guillermo del Toro, as I said. So if you thought there was a lot of creativity in like the gore aspect and the action aspect and all that in the first movie, we're gonna get amplified to all new sorts of levels now. And I like the fact that some critics kind of agree with this too, particularly Ebert, who famously described it as a brilliant vomitorium of viscera. And it's like, I don't even know how you follow that, but we're going to try. Now, it does start off in a way where it does have to start off in typical sequel fashion, where we do get the backstory of the first movie and all that, and we get Blade's backstory all over again. But it is after we get, the sort of cold open with Nomak, but even so, it's like, part of me wishes the movie just kind of started without that, because we know what happened. But at the same time, it's like, it seems easy to forgive, because in a movie that is so generous with just how constant it is, like how the action is really just non-stop throughout the whole thing, more or less, it feels pretty greedy to say, hey, you shouldn't have done that recap for 45 seconds or however long it was. Um, because obviously we get the Nomad opening, and then there's that, but then it goes right into the opening action scene when he's chasing Rush and all those guys, and he's jumping through the rafters and all that, and it just starts immediately. So yeah, it's really hard to complain about little things like that in a movie that is just so giving in regards to just going and going and going. And the fact that does have time for that creativity and those ideas, even despite the fact that it feels like a movie that's constantly moving. Because you've got, on top of reintroducing the old characters, like I said, it does feel a bit clumsy how they say, oh, Whistler's actually still alive, you know, he shot himself, but then they turned him, and then they kept him, and then we bring him out and we make him good again. It's all kind of a clusterfuck here as far as Whistler goes, but the fact that it all happens early and we get Whistler back on our side as soon as possible so that the movie can move forward is appreciated at the end of the day. So, once all that's established, we do have some new characters here. Like, I was talking about Nomak, and really just the Reapers in general, with their freaky ass design and the fact that he basically later in the movie they talk about how like basically the bloodlust is basically like a drug addiction, like a heroin addiction or something. And the fact that when we see Noak, not just in this opening scene, obviously with the hood up and everything, but throughout the entire movie, he just looks like a wandering crack addict before we really get a good look at him. And we learn what exactly the crease in from his neck to his chin actually is, and just has Del Toro monster written all over it, and even the design when we see like an autopsy of one of them later, it just really feels like it goes all in with these new things they set up, and the nice setup at the very beginning, when like his closing line before we go into the movie is "I hate vampires." Because your first thought when you're watching the movie is probably, oh, that's an interesting creative-looking vampire. But then that line reveals to us that he's a whole other different thing, and that there is now something that even the humans and the vampires will have to team up to stop, because they are that much going to fuck shit up. So, once that's established, we also meet the Blood Pack, who has some recognizable faces. Matt Schultz, who you'll know from, like, you know, the first and fifth Fast and Furious movie. He's somewhere in the first Blade as a different character, but I've never been able to spot him. But now he's here, and there's also Donnie Yen is also in there, and Snipes and Donnie Yen, among others, were actually also responsible for the choreography of the fight scenes also, which really adds a sort of personal touch to when we actually see them doing it. But the main person in the Blood Pack we meet, obviously, is Reinhardt, who's played by Ron Perlman, who, once again, we're very grateful. The teaming of Del Toro and Perlman is always going to work in one way or another. So, to see them banter throughout the movie is one of the more pleasing aspects of the movie itself. Where it's like, this is a character we just met, but between them, it is just constant, the way they go at each other. It feels like these are characters we've watched a whole series of up to this point. But we've just met the Perlman character, and we already feel that the second they start talking to each other, and it's amazing. And like the whole, like opening with the "Can you blush" line just really sets off this whole rivalry. It's also how the rivalry ends. But then, and we see also the way that Perlman kind of towers over him, and he comes off as like this tough figure, but we kind of figure out, like, after the "Can you blush" moment, it's going to be one of those things of, oh, that's going to come back to bite you at some point. We're going to let it, you know, slide for now because we got to work together. No, Blade immediately puts him in his place, but not enough to the point that it stops the banter entirely. It's nonstop throughout, like, every interaction they have throughout the movie. But it's nice that, like, we see that immediately Blade is not going to take his shit, or just let anything slide. So we do the whole explosive in the back of the head thing. We do the lasers pointing at each other scene later, which is really great. In the way that, obviously, these two guys have to team up, but eventually it will come to a point where they have to have a showdown, as short-lived as that showdown is, but still incredible anyway. And we get to the point where Blade has to use the very old line, keep your friends close and your enemies closer thing, which is pretty much the perfect line to use given the setup here. But another thing to point out is that it seems almost intentional that they use that particular line from Godfather 2. And it's like establishing that this line, it almost seems like a direct reference to not only using that line in an appropriate context, but the fact that this too is the second movie in a series. It makes perfect sense. So, another new character is Norman Reedus as Scud, who we learn has basically been putting this operation together with Blade while Whistler has been out of commission. And he's basically this tech guy who is a lot more, for some reason, I'm pretty sure I was already familiar with the Boondock Saints at this point, but I had seen the movie many times before I realized that was Norman Reedus. But it's clearly obvious now, but I guess that was back when I still wasn't quite paying as much attention to that kind of stuff. But yeah, and of course throughout the entire movie, for some reason, Scud likes to watch the Powerpuff Girls. And I have to say that one of the more pleasing aspects of life is when you're watching Blade 2 with the commentary. The commentary with Del Toro and Wesley Snipes. And Wesley Snipes asks what the Powerpuff Girls is, and you get to hear Guillermo del Toro explain to Wesley Snipes what the Powerpuff Girls is. It's just very satisfying in itself. And like, that's the whole reason I'm glad it's even in the movie at all, because we got to witness that moment. And then, yeah, so all these people are teaming up to go after the Reapers, and then the movie is constant action from then on. And yeah, like I was talking about, just to get it out of the way right away, yeah, there's going to be some kind of somewhat dated CGI here, and some of the best scenes, too, whether it be when they come in at the start when they're at, you know, Blade's lair, and they come in like acrobats, and they've got like the red eyes and all that, and they come in nice and silently like ninjas, and it's like, it's really cool, but it also looks incredibly animated. You got the fight with Nomak, you've got a number of cases where the CGI is very apparent, and they kind of look like Bullseye and Daredevil a little bit. So, but like I was saying before in the first movie, for some the action is just so incredibly involving and engaging that it's something that I notice, but it just doesn't bother me. Like, I mean, it really should, because it really stands out. You can really fucking tell how CGI it is. But I know the action is just so well done in this, and what's there and appears to be real really works. It's like it's not enough to bring it down, because the rest of the action is just so fucking well done. And like I said, so constant, just throughout the whole thing. It's like, and yet there's still, like, you know, a lot of, you know, heavy cutting. But not enough to, like, keep you from knowing, like, what's happening, like, which character is getting attacked by what, and where this fight is. You can still see the fight clearly, so there's still that excitement there, even if it might be, because we're in that era now where you're extra cool if you don't have as many cuts in your action scenes, because people are starting to learn that that doesn't necessarily help. And movies tend to really, really overdo it. And this is one that does have a lot of, you know, cutting in its action scenes, but it still manages to look really good and really exciting anyway. And sort of enhances it the way the editing should, as opposed to us realizing it in one way or another. And then there is the fact that, that there's really not a whole lot to the movie. Once we set it up and there's just the action, that's basically how it is. Like when you talk about something like Fury Road, to use a recent example, where when you say what the plot is, it's pretty thin. Like, it's just kind of one line. It's the action that's just nonstop that sort of gets you there. And the fact is like, you could basically break this movie down into, what, 5 parts. You've got the opening. You've got the scene in Blade's lair, you've got the club, you've got the sewer, and you got the climax. That's the whole movie, pretty much. It's that simple, but there's just so much action and characters that are so fun to watch, and interact with each other, and you see the enemies working together and all that, and the enemies fighting the other enemies. There's one of my favorite fight scenes ever is the ending fight between Blade and Nomak in this movie. And what's interesting about that is it's not even the first time they fight in the movie. They get a nice big one in the middle. The ending fight, which is one of the best fights ever, is like a round two. It's a continuation of a fight that's in the middle of the movie, which involves them fighting on this very narrow pathway that's in the middle of the air. And at one point, it might even seem a little silly. But still, just the devotion to the constant action in this moment when Nomak tackles Blade off this pathway and they are falling, and as they are falling, Nomak is still punching him in the face in midair as they are dropping to the ground. It's just the movie is that fucking constant in how much this action goes and how hard it goes, and it's really just perfect. And like I said, there's still plenty of time for the character interaction. There's still plenty of time for gore. Like I was talking about, the Reaper autopsy is really memorable. And the fact that we realize that their hearts are encased in bone, so you have to break through that in order to kill them. There's the whole thing where Priest explodes and just that one portion of his head is there. Yeah, so all of that stuff is still there. Once again, Priest's head also kind of looks really CGI, especially with the blinking eye, but I mean, still just sadistic and bloody enough that it's pleasing to people that go into a movie like Blade, and this is what they would expect to see. It's gonna be there in all of its glory, so yes. I mean, like I said, really just the threat in general of the Reapers, where they've got the freaky look, they've got that animalistic way about them, and they're really fucking fast. And it's, yeah, so just, because you look at it and you're like, well, okay, so they fought vampires before, how can we amp that up? And it's like, well, they're still kind of vampires, but they're actually something more, and you've got Del Toro, you know, in charge of creating monsters, which is exactly what he does. It's always been his passion, it's always been his love, it's the reason he makes movies is monsters. So what better choice for a movie like this could there have been, especially a movie where you have to set out to top the first movie and all it had to offer. So, yes. And then it gets to a point also where the action has to become so constant, because it's like, basically everybody is bad by the end, except Whistler and the girl, pretty much. Because, and this is where it's actually nice that they turned Whistler back so early. So it's like they got him on our side as soon as they possibly could, because basically everybody else is fucking bad. Because you've got Nomak's father and that whole plot going on. You've got Nomak himself and everything he's planning, and the way he's like this constant force that's coming closer and closer as this climax is happening. You've got the remaining members of the Blood Pack going bad, particularly Reinhardt, who we always knew was going to be bad, and always was going to have to fight Blade at some point. Like I said, not much of a fight, but the fact that it's not much of a fight is kind of all the more satisfying. A satisfying conclusion to their whole thing. Then you've got all these, you know, hordes of people that are fighting Blade off. And you've got Scud, even ends up being bad. So, and basically, but you take Whistler out of it and you take the girl out of it. The climax is Blade versus fucking everyone. And it's amazing. It's as amazing as it sounds. So, that's, yeah, like I said, there's really not much to this, and there didn't need to be. As long as it did all that stuff well, it became like the perfect sequel. Like I said, not just to the first movie, but kind of just in general. I just really, really fucking love this movie so much. It was one of those movies where I was kind of wondering if I'd love it as much, especially with how well the first movie held up. But no, Blade 2 is still fucking incredible, I am so happy to say. So, yes. That's what that is, and now with that in mind, the party is officially over. So, now, this is one of those cases where, when Blade Trinity came out, 2 years after Blade 2, Um, I remember it getting out before I saw it, that people weren't taking to it that much. And there were kind of some signs here and there that it wasn't going to be up to par. Certainly not up to par with how Del Toro left it. Um, and it's one of those movies that I remember going to see. And I was, at the time, when I was like 13, if I really, really wanted to like a movie, there was a chance I probably could have convinced myself that something was good. But that wasn't going to happen for this. And I don't want to just, completely hate on it, because that's the really easy thing to do, to treat it like people treat, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and stuff like that, where they just say, oh, we'll pretend that doesn't exist and stuff like that. It's not like there isn't some stuff in here that does work, or there are hints of something that really could have worked. I mean, once again, it's still... Not that, Gore's the most reliable of writers, but he is like the one consistent factor here outside of Snipes and Christopherson. So, what do we have exactly? Well, we start off with Ryan Reynolds narrating. Great. My thoughts on Ryan Reynolds are mixed, obviously. But as I've mentioned many times before, I grew really tired of the Deadpool thing really fast. And we all know the Deadpool thing is kind of what Ryan Reynolds has not so secretly been doing this whole time, like from Van Wilder forward. So, I mean, yeah, it's like, he never changes, and he probably never will. But he begins, and what I was saying about the first movie, how we could forgive it with its whole thing, and back in 1998 it was saying, forget what the movies told you, the crosses and the holy water and all that, that's just movie stuff, this is what's really going on and all that. And I was like, okay, that was back, before it was played out, so we'll forgive it, and it was cool at the time, so we'll go with it. Well, they've decided to cash in on it again in its opening lines. In its opening lines of narration, we have Ryan Reynolds telling us that the movies are full of shit, and this is how it really goes. And that's shortly followed by a vampire completely covered, giving the sun the finger in a nice close-up shot. It's like, okay, so what we were talking about last week with the new Hellboy, and how it was trying a little too hard. There's... Yeah, I was having flashbacks of it when I was revisiting Blade Trinity to talk about it now. Because if I didn't revisit Blade Trinity, I wasn't going to remember what the fuck to even talk about. So, here we are. So, and as it also opens, it gets very much, early 2000s action movie. Clearly not on the level that Blade 2 was. Now we've got shit like, in order to be cool and stylized, we gotta do the thing where Parker Posey drops her lantern so that we can have vampires attacking with a strobe effect. How exciting. Sometimes it's dark and sometimes we can see them. Fascinating. And then, before the movie's barely even started, we are introduced to vampire vibrators. I feel like I don't need to make any more points in regards to the whole trying too hard angle this movie's clearly taking. But I do feel the need to mention the vampire vibrators, just to completely and totally solidify that. And that's before Ryan Reynolds has even been seen on screen, but we'll get to that. So, when we start off with this one action scene, like I said, there is promise here. I like the whole thing where Blade is in his... the other two movies, we didn't get much action in regards to Blade and his car. So the fact that he's in his car and driving it while vampires coming in one at a time that he has to fight off while he's driving is kind of cool. And the fact that he's got the lights at the front of his car and all that, that can disintegrate them. There is something here, but it does show us very quickly it's going to be it's going to be a lot more guilty of the heavily cut action scene sort of thing. The thing that Del Toro did just fine in the second movie, where there was a lot of cutting, but it still felt very coherent. It was still very exciting. We could see what was going on and all that. And the funny thing is we can still... the action scenes still feel coherent, even despite the fact that Blade 2 is actually set in a lot of, really, really dark settings. But you can still tell what's going on. This one, not so much. It falls much more in line with what we know today as the overly edited action scene is what a lot of the movie is. So we're dealing with that. And then after the movie hasn't even been on half an hour, and they're fucking with Whistler. So you know what I really really hated was the movie Red with Bruce Willis and John Malkovich and all them. Um, the thing about that was what was really stupid in that movie was that there's a whole subplot where Morgan Freeman fakes his death. And then shortly after it's revealed that Morgan Freeman's still alive, they kill him for real, really anticlimactically. That's basically what they did to Whistler in this series. So we do the whole thing where he's killed in the first movie. Then they actually find a way to bring him back in the second movie that's a bit convoluted, but ultimately works in the long run because it's just great to have him back and he works well in the story and the way he plays off the other characters. I didn't even mention his whole banter going on with Norman Reedus, and then like just as he starts to liken Scott Guy's Bad Thing, I really love. And he's like almost disappointed when he blows up. Yeah, after all that, they're gonna kill Whistler for good less than half an hour into this movie. Why? I guess so they can do the bring in the younger actors thing. Bring in Jessica Biel and Ryan Reynolds. Two people that are a really big deal to a lot of people where I just don't see it. And that's just the way it is. It's how I felt in 2004. It's how I feel now, really. So we bring in her to be Whistler's daughter, and she's got Ryan Reynolds with her, and they are the Night Stalkers. I had to double check that. Because it does have, if there's one thing about this DVD, it does come with this somewhat helpful comic inside it. That gives us a bit of a backstory on the Night Stalkers and basically how they get from where they started to teaming up with Blade. But apart from that, we've got her with her little saber thing that she says is half as hot as the sun, which seems pretty unsafe to just turn that on in their little lab, but okay, we'll go with it, I suppose. And Ryan Reynolds comes equipped with his quips, with his Ryan Reynoldsness. And I guess that works for a lot of people, so we'll do that. We'll have scenes of them walking around, and he's doing his Ryan Reynolds thing, saying his Ryan Reynolds lines, which are probably ad-libbed, which is painfully obvious, and just annoying Blade, more or less. So we'll have scenes like when he's just talking and talking and talking, and then Blade just glares at him, and he gets scared, and he says, "Sorry, I ate a lot of sugar today." And then there's like a 30-second pause. 30 seconds is a long time when you're just sitting there of just silence for the audience to lose their minds in raucous laughter at the fact that Ryan Reynolds ate some sugar today. I'm gonna laugh myself into a coma if I don't stop, so we should move on. And that's basically Hannibal King's character. And I mean, you can do the whole, I don't know the source material enough to know. I did some research. I glanced at the Wikipedia page of Hannibal King to decide if that's the way the character was in the source material, or if it's Ryan Reynolds being Ryan Reynolds. In the event that I had a feeling somebody could potentially make that argument. And the only thing I learned was that in the movie, apparently he was turned into a vampire by Parker Posey, when in actuality he's got like a whole like Deacon Frost related side plot, which, you know, probably would have been kind of cool to add into this movie, despite the fact that Deacon Frost is now dead at this point, and the whole kind of tying it into the whole thing. But yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and, you know, tie him into the characters that we just met, because we just met him too, why not? And so we have our villain. Our villain is none other than Dracula, played by Dominic Purcell. And this is kind of an issue because I'm trying to figure out, because at the start of it, like right on paper, like it just immediately, if somebody runs the idea by you, they say, we're going to try to make the ultimate Blade movie. So we're gonna make the villain in the movie Dracula. So the movie is basically Blade versus Dracula. I mean, how fucking cool is that? But the more you think about that, the more you wonder, that is a great idea on paper, but with the different versions of Dracula we know, just how could they have done this without it being totally lame? Like, which version of Dracula could we have gotten that this wasn't totally lame when you try to put him in the Blade universe? So their idea was to make him a, a, a massive tool named Drake that the makers of Queen of the Damned probably would have rejected, and go with that. And he can change into other people. He can change into Whistler because Chris Christopherson's second credited needed just a little more screen time to warrant that. And to kind of make sure he was still here so the fans didn't feel too pissed that we killed him off before the first half hour was up. But I mean, apart from that, there's not a whole lot here with that. I mean, his final form could have looked cool if he had more of like a Tim Curry and Legend kind of makeup job as opposed to the CGI they went with. But I don't know. It just sort of seemed like a really early stage where this went wrong. And like I said, I think the whole Blade versus Dracula thing is something that sounds awesome in concept, but when you really break it down, it's like, how could they have pulled that off, though, to where it really, really, really worked? And I struggle to come to a conclusion to that, but maybe there's somebody out there, but I just don't. Yeah, so so it's one of those cases where like you can tell they love the concept and just sort of ran with it without thinking too much about it, and then they backed themselves into a corner, and we got what we got, which is extremely, incredibly underwhelming. To the point that this movie even has vampire dogs. Basically the equivalent of Ang Lee's Hulk movie when we had like Hulk dogs. Remember that? That's basically what we have here. And it's pretty much played for comedy, which, shockingly enough, isn't helping. It's like it's not. I mean, it's not doing it. It wouldn't be doing it any favors to play it straight. But trying to go full comedy with it isn't. There's just so many ideas in this movie that were never gonna work, which sucks because there's some ideas that probably could have. And the movie does have its moments. One thing that's worth noting is that for a Blade movie, it has a very odd cast list. I mentioned Parker Posey as one of the main villains, who I absolutely love, but I mean, it's like going from the indie queen to this is odd. I'll say that. Then you've got Eric Bogosian as the dude on TV with John Michael Higgins, also odd casting. Patton Oswalt as like their tech guy. And Patton Oswalt actually, there's an interview of him somewhere where he's talking about his time on this movie, and where he basically said it was like a clusterfuck on the set, where like nobody's getting along with the director. Snipes was constantly in his trailer, and he wouldn't come out, and everything smelled like weed near him, and he could tell it was falling apart. He can sense the disappointment in people when he says, "I was in Blade," and they're like, "Really?" And he's like, "Well, I was in that Blade." It's like, oh, well, never mind. You were cool for like half a second. But yeah, and also one of the main draws at the time, I remember this was like a really big deal at the time. One of the other main vampires with Parker Posey, Triple H, was one of the main draws to this at the time. And we've also got Natasha Lyonne in an interesting enough part, where she doesn't feel too out of place, and she plays an interesting enough character, who doesn't really get enough screen time, but gets an effective enough sort of send-off. Like one of the more effective scenes in the movie, it might be the best scene in the movie actually, is the scene where Dracula has already hit the place, and Natasha Lyonne doesn't realize she's by herself because she's blind, and she's already had her daughter go off and hide. So she's walking around like the lab area and all that, not realizing Patton Oswalt and the other guy are like dead at her feet, and she doesn't even realize it, and she can barely sense that something is horribly wrong, and something is like stalking her that she can't see because she can't see anything around her, or the carnage that's there to warn her. Ultimately leading to her death, which is like this driving force for Jessica Biel to go really hardcore, despite the fact that you would think her dead dad would be that enough, but whatever. And then there's like another scene later where Parker Posey gets to go like full on diabolical, which is amazing. Where she has that plan where she's got Natasha Lyonne's daughter, and she's like, "I'm gonna bite you, and then I'm gonna leave this girl in here with you and wait for you to turn, and then you're just gonna have to." When your thirst reaches its peak, you're gonna have to kill her whether you like it or not, because that's gonna be your vampire instinct. That's pretty wicked and villainy, and I really like that. But not that that comes to fruition or anything, but it's a really cool villain plan. So apart from that, then it just goes into your basic ass action scenes, your anticlimactic, villain deaths, and all that other stuff. Where, like I said, everything about the others that was great is just gone. Where the action feels all cut up. There's none of that quietness with Blade, where he's like, really going into his identity and that, feuding inside himself with the two different parts of him. There's no cool particular side characters with, like I said, if anything, it's not that the side characters are cool, it's that their casting is so baffling, you're just wondering who's going to come on screen next. And of course, as I was talking about many times over, it's not funny when it wants to be, which is excruciating. So that's pretty much what Blade Trinity's reputation is. But like I said, every now and then there's a moment in there where you're like, maybe this could have worked, or maybe if they just flushed this out a little more, they could have gone in a more creative direction or a different direction entirely. That somehow could have worked, but as it is, it just feels like most of the early ideas are what brought it down, and they kind of backed themselves into a corner and had to work with stuff that was always going to take them to a dead end, which is exactly where we ended up. So, unfortunate conclusion to this trilogy, but at least we have 1 and 2. So, as far as, like, I guess you could say, like, a ranking order or whatever, obviously I'm always going to have a soft spot for 2, no matter what, but, I don't know, it's really shocking to me how much I like the first one, seeing it again, even though I always liked it. I don't know, it's just even better than I suspected, so I would almost say, just in chronological order, just they go from best to worst, but I still think 2 is always going to kind of be, yeah, 2 is just going to kind of always be my thing, I guess, so that's how I feel about those. I guess we'll see what happens when this character inevitably returns in one form or another, however that may be. Wasn't there like a TV series or something that was really short-lived? I know almost nothing about that, but except that it kind of existed. But surely before too long, especially seeing, like I said, how much of the stuff we praise nowadays is in the first movie, that somebody's going to jump on this before too long. It's so weird, especially nowadays, to see the page-flipping Marvel logo in front of Trinity. Uh, but, yeah, so that's how I feel about those. So, as I was saying, I actually shot the next one before this, but in that I remember what the next versus is going to be after the next one. So it's going to be these in a row. I'm going to do I saw both Twilight Zone episodes that I've missed. I was going to do something about that, and then hopefully do some catch-up on movies before Endgame. So we'll see how that goes. So until all that, that's it for this.